In my analysis of the human condition, particularly within the context of spiritual and emotional health, I frequently encounter a pervasive and exhausting phenomenon: the individual whose life has become a ceaseless exercise in crisis management, driven by the demands of others. This is the fundamental problem of the boundaryless existence. We observe individuals who are ostensibly successful and functioning, yet who suffer from a profound fragmentation of the self. They possess the outward trappings of adulthood, careers, families, responsibilities, but lack the essential internal structure required to possess their own lives. They are akin to a nation without borders, where any traveler may enter, pillage, or occupy territory at will, leaving the rightful sovereign besieged and impoverished within their own domain. The problem manifests initially not as a catastrophic failure of character, but as a subtle, creeping exhaustion. It appears in the life of the person who cannot refuse a request, regardless of the personal cost. It reveals itself in the parent who cannot distinguish their own anxiety from their child's distress, or the employee who silently absorbs the negligence of a colleague. The core of this dysfunction is a critical error in understanding ownership. When an individual loses the ability to distinguish what is their responsibility from what is not, they inevitably fall into one of two traps. They either erroneously shoulder the burdens of others, crushing themselves in the process, or they abdicate their own legitimate responsibilities, becoming a burden to those around them. This confusion of ownership is the central pathology we must examine. To understand the magnitude of this problem, we must first establish a precise definition of the boundary itself. In the physical realm, the concept is intuitive. Fences, walls, and property lines delineate where one person's dominion ends and another's begins. These markers create the legal and physical reality of ownership. If I own a plot of land, I am legally responsible for its maintenance. If the grass withers, it is my negligence that is to blame. Conversely, I am not responsible for the maintenance of my neighbor's garden. I may offer help if I choose, but the ultimate weight of ownership lies with him. In the spiritual and emotional realms, however, these lines are invisible, and consequently, they are frequently violated or ignored. A boundary, in the psychological sense, is the defining edge of the self. It constitutes the spiritual demarcation that identifies what is me and what is not me. This distinction is not merely a matter of philosophical abstraction but of vital survival. Without a clear boundary, an individual cannot maintain a distinct identity. If I do not know where I end and you begin, I cannot love you, for there is no I to do the loving. I can only merge with you, or be consumed by you. The problem we face in so many relationships is not an excessive separation, but a terrifying lack of it, a fusion that masquerades as intimacy but is in fact a mutual parasitic entanglement. The tragedy of the boundaryless life is often most visible in the distortion of biblical concepts of service and self-denial. We see individuals who believe that love requires the complete erasure of the self, interpreting the refusal of any request as an act of selfishness. They live in a perpetual state of reaction, bouncing from one person's emergency to another's demand, driven by a fear of rejection or a compulsion to please. They have lost the ability to act as agents of their own will. They do not give freely, because they do not feel free to withhold. A gift that cannot be withheld is not a gift. It is a tribute paid under duress. Thus, the problem is not that these individuals serve too much, but that their service is rooted in compliance rather than freedom. They are slaves to the expectations of others, and slavery, even when dressed in the guise of virtue, breeds deep and corrosive resentment. We must refine our understanding of responsibility by examining the crucial linguistic and conceptual distinction between a burden and a load. In the foundational texts that inform this analysis, there is a clear separation between the crushing, boulder-like crises of life and the daily, manageable cargo of individual existence. The problem arises when this distinction collapses. We are ethically obligated to aid one another in times of crisis, when the weight of circumstance exceeds a person's capacity to cope. This is the bearing of a burden. However, we are equally obligated to carry our own daily cargo, the knapsack of our personal feelings, attitudes, and behaviors. The dysfunction of boundarylessness occurs when we attempt to carry another person's knapsack, or when we expect someone else to carry ours. When we assume responsibility for tasks that belong to another's daily load, we do not help them, we disable them. We intercept the natural consequences of their actions, preventing them from learning the lessons of cause and effect, while simultaneously exhausting our own reserves. This confusion necessitates a detailed inventory of the self. To establish a boundary is to define what falls within one's own executive jurisdiction. If we are to address the problem of the boundaryless life, we must identify exactly what constitutes the property of the soul, that is, the specific elements for which we are accountable and over which we must exercise control. The first and perhaps most volatile of these elements is our emotional life. Feelings are the sensory apparatus of the soul. They are indicators of our internal state. In the boundaryless individual, feelings are often disowned or projected. Such a person may believe that others make them feel angry or sad, thereby abdicating control over their own emotional landscape. Conversely, they may feel responsible for the happiness of others, frantically adjusting their behavior to soothe the anxieties or tempers of those around them. This is a fundamental error. We own our feelings. They function as warning signals and motivators that belong solely to us. Similarly, our attitudes and beliefs fall squarely within our property lines. These form the orientation of the self toward the world. A common symptom of the problem is the adoption of a victim mentality, wherein an individual nurtures an attitude of helplessness, blaming external circumstances or other people for their condition. This disownership of attitude is a primary barrier to growth. If I believe that my misery is caused entirely by your behavior, I am absolved of the difficult work of changing my own stance. I remain passive, waiting for you to change, a strategy that is almost invariably doomed to failure. The boundaryless person fails to realize that while they cannot control the wind, they are entirely responsible for the set of their own sails. The domain of behavior constitutes another critical area of ownership. The law of cause and effect is the engine of reality. Actions produce consequences. In a healthy system, the person who acts is the person who experiences the consequence. The problem of boundary violation disrupts this mechanism. We see parents who perpetually shield their children from the results of procrastination or sloth, or spouses who shield their partners from the fallout of addiction. By interrupting the natural cycle of action and consequence, the boundaryless individual renders the other person powerless to learn or mature. They mistakenly believe they are being loving, when in fact they are merely subsidizing irresponsibility. The failure to own one's behavior, and the failure to allow others to own theirs, creates a chaotic environment where learning is suspended and destructive patterns are reinforced. Furthermore, we must consider the ownership of choices. The boundaryless life is characterized by a passive yielding to external pressure, resulting in a pervasive sense of powerlessness. Such individuals often use language that betrays this abdication, claiming they had to do something or were forced into a decision. This is an illusion. With the exception of physical coercion, we are always making choices. The denial of this agency leads to a bitter and resentful existence. When we pretend that our choices are external mandates, we strip ourselves of the dignity of free will. We give begrudgingly, not out of love, but out of a compulsion to avoid conflict or guilt. The recovery of the self begins with the acknowledgement that every yes and every no is a sovereign act of the will for which we are accountable. The inventory continues with values, limits, and resources. We are responsible for what we value, what we assign importance to in the economy of our hearts. If we value the approval of others above truth, our lives will reflect that disorder. We are responsible for our limits, the finite amount of emotional, physical, and mental energy we possess. The boundaryless person lives in a state of denial regarding these limits, perpetually overcommitting and then resenting the inevitable exhaustion. They act as though they are infinite, and when their finiteness asserts itself in the form of burnout or illness, they feel victimized. Finally, we are responsible for our talents and desires. To bury one's talent out of fear, or to ignore one's true desires in favor of pleasing others, is a failure of stewardship. It is a negation of the unique design imprinted upon the self. Having defined the territory of the self, we must now analyze the specific topologies of boundary dysfunction. The problem does not manifest in a uniform manner. Rather, it presents itself in distinct behavioral syndromes, each with its own internal logic and destructive consequences. We can categorize these dysfunctions into 4 primary types: the compliant, the avoidant, the controller, and the non-responsive. These categories are not mutually exclusive. An individual may exhibit characteristics of several or shift between them depending on the relationship, but they serve as useful diagnostic tools for understanding the architecture of the problem. The compliant is perhaps the most recognizable victim of boundary failure. This is the individual who possesses no defense against the demands of others. Their emotional radar is tuned exclusively to the needs and desires of those around them, rendering them incapable of recognizing or defending their own. The compliant says yes to the bad. They agree to requests that are harmful, intrusive, or simply draining, driven by a profound fear of rejection or conflict. They function like a house with no doors. Anyone can enter at any time and take whatever they wish. The compliant often rationalizes this inability to set limits as a virtue, confusing their fear-based submission with compassion or loyalty. However, beneath the veneer of agreeableness lies a reservoir of unexpressed anger and resentment. By failing to say no, the compliant erodes their own identity, becoming a distinct reflection of the people they are trying to please. In contrast, the avoidant suffers from an inability to say yes to the good. If the compliant has no walls, the avoidant has walls that are impenetrable. They are incapable of letting help, love, or intimacy in. When they are in need, they withdraw. When they are hurt, they isolate. This dysfunction often stems from a lack of trust or a fear of vulnerability. The avoidant sees their own needs as a weakness or a burden to others, and thus maintains a rigid self-sufficiency that starves the soul. This is a boundary problem because the purpose of a boundary is to be permeable, to have a gate that can be opened to welcome the beneficial and closed to bar the destructive. The avoidant has welded the gate shut, creating a prison of isolation in the name of safety. The third type, the controller, represents the aggressive side of boundary dysfunction. The controller does not respect the boundaries of others. They are unable to hear the word no. They view the limits of other people not as legitimate lines of demarcation, but as challenges to be overcome or obstacles to be bulldozed. Controllers come in two varieties: the aggressive controller, who uses intimidation and anger to force compliance, and the manipulative controller, who uses guilt, seduction, or persuasion to maneuver others into submission. In both cases, the core pathology is the same: a refusal to accept the reality of the other person's separateness. The controller seeks to annex the will of others, treating them as extensions of their own ego. They project responsibility for their happiness onto others, and when others fail to comply, the controller feels victimized or enraged. This inability to accept the freedom of others renders genuine intimacy impossible, for love can only exist between two free agents. Finally, we have the non-responsive individual. This person fails to hear the yes of the needs of others. They ignore the legitimate responsibilities of love and connection. While we are not responsible for the lives of others, we are responsible to them, to provide support, empathy, and care within appropriate limits. The non-responsive type is often characterized by a kind of narcissism or critical detachment, oblivious to the impact of their indifference on those around them. They may view the needs of others as annoyances or weaknesses, maintaining a cold distance that they mistake for healthy independence. In reality, this is a failure of stewardship. They are neglecting the duty to love and connect, which is central to the human experience. It is crucial to observe how these types often gravitate toward one another in a symbiotic dance of dysfunction. The compliant and the controller are frequently drawn together in a magnetic but destructive pairing. The controller seeks someone to carry their burdens and soothe their ego. The compliant seeks someone to direct their life and provide a sense of purpose. They fit together like a lock and key, but the door they open leads to mutual misery. The compliant feels used and resentful but is terrified to leave. The controller feels justified and entitled but is fundamentally dependent on the compliant's submission. Similarly, the non-responsive and the avoidant may form relationships defined by a profound emotional vacuum, where neither party engages in the risky work of intimacy. These dysfunctions are further complicated by the distinction between functional and relational boundaries. An individual may possess highly developed functional boundaries, the ability to perform tasks, manage money, and execute schedules with ruthless efficiency, while possessing practically no relational boundaries. This person can run a corporation but cannot tell their mother to stop criticizing their spouse. Conversely, one may have strong relational opinions but be completely unable to organize their functional life. The problem of boundaries is pervasive, infiltrating every aspect of human interaction, from the boardroom to the bedroom. We must also recognize that these boundary conflicts are not merely external struggles, they are internal wars. We struggle to set limits not only on others but on our own impulses and desires. The same inability to say no to a demanding friend translates into an inability to say no to an urge to overspend, overeat, or indulge in destructive habits. The internal boundary is the mechanism of self-control, the ability to deny an immediate gratification for the sake of a future good. When this internal structure is weak, the self is held hostage by its own appetites. The problem, therefore, is a systemic failure of governance. The executive center of the self, the will, has abdicated its throne, leaving the personality ruled by fear, appetite, or the demands of the crowd. The genesis of this chaotic state is rarely a mystery. It is almost always rooted in the developmental history of the individual. The infant enters the world in a state of boundarylessness, utterly dependent on the mother for survival. There is no I and you, only a fused reality of need and provision. The task of growing up is essentially the task of building boundaries, of moving from this state of fusion to a state of individuation. This process, referred to as hatching, requires a delicate balance of connection and separation. The child must feel safe enough to venture out, to disagree, to say no, and to experience the consequences of their own actions. If this developmental process is interrupted or distorted, the adult emerges with a damaged boundary structure. We see the roots of the compliant in the child whose parents withdrew love in response to disagreement, teaching the lesson that autonomy equals abandonment. We see the roots of the controller in the child who was never given limits, who learned that their will was omnipotent and that others existed merely to serve their desires. We see the roots of the avoidant in the child whose needs were met with hostility or neglect, teaching them that to ask for help is to invite pain. These early injuries freeze the soul in a state of immaturity. The adult continues to act out the drama of the nursery, searching for the safety they never had, or fleeing the engulfment they always feared. Thus, the problem of the boundaryless life is a problem of arrested development. It is the persistence of childhood patterns of relating in an adult world that demands autonomous functioning. It is the confusion of love with fusion, of responsibility with rescue, of service with slavery. It is a state of spiritual and emotional homelessness, where the individual has no secure territory to call their own, and consequently, has nothing of value to offer the world. Until the property lines are surveyed and the fences rebuilt, the self remains a thoroughfare, trampled by the traffic of life, incapable of cultivating the fruit it was designed to bear. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. Having established the anatomy of the boundaryless self and the topologies of dysfunction that arise from it, we must now descend into the causal substructure of the problem. It is not enough to identify the symptoms of the compliant or the controller. We must interrogate the genesis of these distortions. The inability to say no, the compulsion to rescue, and the paralysis of the will are not arbitrary character flaws, nor are they inherited traits like eye color or height. They are constructed realities, the architectural results of a specific developmental history. To understand why an adult finds themselves unable to possess their own life, we must examine the construction site of the soul, childhood. The capacity to establish boundaries is not innate, it is learned. It is a developmental achievement as fundamental as language or locomotion. This learning process occurs within a critical window of early life, a period where the foundational structures of the personality are poured and set. If the environment during this window is deficient or hostile, the structure will be flawed, and the adult will eventually buckle under the weight of life's demands. The process begins not with separation, but with its opposite, attachment. Before a child can say no, they must have a secure yes. They must know that they exist in a safe, bonded relationship with a caregiver. This foundation of safety is the prerequisite for all future risk-taking. If the foundation is cracked, if the child does not feel securely held and loved, they will never feel safe enough to venture out, to disagree, or to define themselves as separate, for the risk of abandonment would be too psychologically catastrophic. From this base of security, the child embarks on the terrifying and exhilarating project of separation and individuation. This is the psychological birth of the self. It proceeds through distinct phases, beginning with hatching, where the infant realizes that they and the mother are not a single entity. It moves into a practicing phase, characterized by an explosion of energy and exploration, a period of perceived omnipotence where the toddler delights in their ability to move away from the safety of the lap. Finally, it settles into rapprochement, a complex negotiation where the child realizes they are small and the world is large, necessitating a return to connection but on new, more separate terms. The crucial tool in this developmental forge is the word no. It is the first verbal boundary, the primary instrument of definition. When a toddler refuses a command or a food, they are not merely being obstinate, they are engaging in the vital work of self-definition. They are establishing the existence of a will distinct from the will of the parent. The parent's response to this emerging autonomy determines whether the boundary will harden into a protective wall, dissolve into nothingness, or mature into a flexible, functional gate. The causal pathology of the boundaryless adult lies in the failure of this developmental dialogue. We can identify specific parental failures, boundary injuries, that arrest this process. The first is withdrawal. When a child attempts to set a boundary or express a difference, and the parent responds by withdrawing love or emotional connection, the child learns a devastating lesson: autonomy equals abandonment. To be me is to be alone. Faced with this existential threat, the child suppresses their boundary, choosing the safety of compliance over the terror of isolation. The adult who emerges from this dynamic lives in perpetual fear that any disagreement will result in the total loss of the relationship. A second injury is hostility. Here, the parent does not withdraw but attacks. The child's attempt at separation is met with anger, punishment, or shaming. The message internalized is that boundaries are dangerous. To have a self is to invite wrath. This produces an adult who is terrified of conflict, who views other people's anger as a lethal threat that must be appeased at all costs. They become experts in reading the emotional temperature of a room, fluidly adapting their own persona to avoid triggering the explosion they have learned to dread. Conversely, we see the injury of overcontrol. This occurs when a parent refuses to allow the child to experience the natural consequences of their actions, or protects them excessively from the risks of the world. By intervening constantly, the parent inhibits the child's ability to learn cause and effect. The child never learns that their actions matter, or that they are capable of navigating difficulty. They learn instead that they are incompetent and dependent, that someone else will always be there to bear the weight of their existence. This produces the adult who feels entitled to rescue, or who feels overwhelmed by the ordinary tasks of life, paralyzed by a learned helplessness. We must also consider the injury of the lack of limits. When a parent offers love without discipline, failing to enforce consequences for negative behavior, the child develops a sense of omnipotence. They never learn to respect the boundaries of others or to delay gratification. They grow up believing that the world exists to serve their impulses. This is the genesis of the controller, the individual who cannot hear no, because they were never taught to accept it. They view the needs of others as annoying obstacles to their own satisfaction, having missed the crucial lesson that they are not the center of the universe. These developmental failures create the psychological conditions for boundary dysfunction, but the perpetuation of the problem in adulthood is governed by a set of immutable principles. We might call these the physics of the relational world. Just as the physical world is governed by gravity and thermodynamics, the world of relationships operates according to spiritual and relational laws. The boundaryless life is essentially a life lived in violation of these laws, and the pain experienced is the friction resulting from this collision with reality. To diagnose the cause of the problem fully, we must unpack these operating principles. The most fundamental of these is the law of sowing and reaping. This is the law of cause and effect. Actions have consequences. If you overspend, you run out of money. If you treat people poorly, you end up alone. In a healthy system, the person who sows the action reaps the consequence. The boundary problem arises when this law is interrupted. In codependent relationships, one person sows, acting irresponsibly, but the other person reaps, bearing the burden of that irresponsibility. A parent pays the debts of a spendthrift adult child. A spouse calls in sick for an alcoholic partner. By stepping in to absorb the consequence, the rescuer effectively anesthetizes the actor against reality. They render the irresponsible person powerless to change, because that person feels no pain to motivate the change. The cause of the dysfunction's persistence is the artificial suspension of this law. Closely related is the law of responsibility. We must distinguish rigorously between being responsible to others and being responsible for others. We are commanded to love one another, to bear one another's burdens in times of overwhelming crisis. This is responsibility too. But we cannot be responsible for another person's feelings, attitudes, choices, or behaviors. We cannot grow for them. We cannot will for them. When we cross this line, attempting to manage the internal state of another, we violate their sovereignty and exhaust our own resources. The cause of much relational burnout is the futile attempt to carry a load that God designed only one person to carry. This brings us to the law of power. We must admit that we are powerless over others. We cannot make an addict stop drinking. We cannot make a critical person kind. We cannot make a spouse loving. This admission is often terrifying because it feels like surrender, but it is actually the beginning of sanity. The boundaryless individual wastes enormous energy trying to wield a power they do not possess, the power to change someone else. Simultaneously, they neglect the one power they do possess, the power to change themselves. We have the power to agree with the truth, to humble ourselves, to ask for help, and to change our own responses. The dysfunction persists because we try to do the impossible, change others, while neglecting the possible, changing ourselves. The functioning of boundaries is also dictated by the law of respect. This is the reciprocal nature of freedom. If we wish our own boundaries to be respected, we must respect the boundaries of others. We cannot demand freedom while acting as a tyrant over the choices of our friends or spouses. This law exposes the hypocrisy often hidden within the victim mentality. We may feel hurt that someone told us no, judging them as selfish or uncaring. In doing so, we deny their freedom. If we judge the boundaries of others, we essentially set a trap for ourselves. We create a culture of judgment in the relationship that ensures our own boundaries will be violated in turn. The cause of the conflict is often our own refusal to accept that others have the right to deny us what we want. We must also examine the law of motivation. This law interrogates the why behind our actions. A boundary-defined life is rooted in freedom. A boundaryless life is rooted in fear. Many individuals give, serve, and agree not out of a heart of love, but out of a terror of what will happen if they do not. They fear the loss of love, the anger of others, the feeling of guilt, or the specter of loneliness. When acts of service are performed under this internal duress, they are not acts of love, they are acts of appeasement. The result is not intimacy, but resentment. We resent the people we serve when we feel we had no choice but to serve them. This corruption of motive turns relationships into prisons. The cause of the misery is the loss of the freedom to say no, which instantly invalidates the yes. Further complicating the landscape is the law of evaluation. Setting boundaries inevitably causes pain. When you refuse a request or confront a behavior, the other person may feel hurt, disappointed, or angry. The boundaryless person confuses this pain with harm. They operate under the false assumption that if they cause someone pain, they have done something wrong. This is a critical error. A dentist causes pain to heal a tooth. A parent causes pain to discipline a child. Pain is a part of life and growth. Harm is injury and destruction. We must evaluate the effects of our boundaries not by whether they cause discomfort, but by whether they serve the ultimate good. The inability to tolerate causing pain, to oneself or others, is a primary cause of staying stuck in destructive patterns. The dynamic of change is governed by the law of proactivity. For many, the discovery of boundaries triggers a reactive phase. They wake up to their victimization and explode in anger, blasting everyone who has ever controlled them. While this reaction is a necessary stage of breaking free, it is not the destination. A reactive stance is still a dependent stance. You are still defined by what you are against. True boundaries are proactive. They are based on values, desires, and deliberate choices. They assert what I am and what I love, rather than just what I hate. The dysfunction lingers when an individual gets stuck in the reactive phase, creating a lifestyle of rebellion rather than establishing a life of positive freedom. We must also confront the law of envy. Envy is the sign that we are looking outside our own boundaries for satisfaction. We look at the good possessed by others, their freedom, their relationships, their success, and we resent them for having it, or we feel that we are somehow deficient. This outward focus distracts us from the work that needs to be done within our own property lines. It is a failure of stewardship. Instead of cultivating our own garden, we stare resentfully at the neighbor's harvest. Envy is a causal factor in boundarylessness because it keeps us in a state of emptiness and passivity, waiting for the world to give us what we have not taken responsibility to create. This passivity is directly addressed by the law of activity. Human beings are designed to be active agents, initiators who knock, seek, and ask. The boundary problem often manifests as passivity, waiting for God or others to do for us what we can only do for ourselves. We wait for a rescue that never comes, because the rescue would violate our integrity as free agents. The failure to initiate, to push against the resistance of life, ensures that the boundaries remain undefined and the self remains undeveloped. Finally, we have the law of exposure. A boundary that is not communicated is not a boundary, it is a secret. Many individuals harbor private resentments or secret limits, withdrawing silently when they are offended, or expecting others to read their minds. This secrecy is a breeding ground for pathology. For a boundary to exist in reality, it must be exposed to the light of relationship. It must be spoken. This exposure is frightening because it opens us to rejection or conflict, but it is the only path to connection. Relationships die in the dark. They can only be healed when the truth of our boundaries is brought into the open. The cause of distance in relationships is often simply the failure to make the invisible visible. These laws describe the mechanics of how the self interacts with the world. When we violate them, when we interrupt cause and effect, when we try to control others, when we act out of fear, when we confuse pain with harm, when we envy rather than act, or when we hide our truth, we generate the chaos that characterizes the boundaryless life. The problem originates in the nursery, in the failures of attachment and separation, but it is sustained in the present by our ongoing refusal to align our lives with these immutable principles of relational reality. We are suffering not just from the wounds of the past, but from our current collision with the laws of the universe. To find a solution, we must stop fighting these laws and begin to operate within them. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. Having mapped the desolate terrain of the boundaryless self and unearthed the developmental and systemic roots of this dysfunction, we arrive at the threshold of reconstruction. The diagnosis is complete. The patient suffers from a structural failure of the will, a confusion of ownership, and a paralysis induced by the violation of relational laws. The remedy, therefore, is not merely behavioral modification or the acquisition of assertiveness techniques. It is a fundamental rebuilding of the personality, a spiritual and psychological renovation that restores the individual to their rightful status as a steward of their own life. This is the solution. However, the path from realization to actualization is not a smooth trajectory. It is a campaign. To reclaim the territory of the soul is an act of warfare against entrenched patterns, external expectations, and internal fears. The implementation of boundaries is never a passive event. It is a disruption of the status quo. When an individual who has functioned as a compliant supplier of needs suddenly closes the gates, the system experiences a shock. We must anticipate and strategize for the inevitable counterforce, resistance. This resistance operates on two fronts: the external pressure from those who benefit from our lack of boundaries, and the internal sabotage from our own unhealed wounds and conditioned reflexes. External resistance is the most immediate and tangible threat. When we begin to say, "No," we must expect anger. This anger is rarely a righteous response to a wrong committed. Rather, it is the frustration of a controller losing control. It is the tantrum of a dependent entity denied its accustomed supply. The crucial intellectual shift required here is to reinterpret this anger not as a condemnation of our actions, but as a confirmation of the boundary's necessity. If our limit setting provokes rage, it serves as diagnostic proof that the relationship was fueled by compliance rather than freedom. We must learn to view this anger as a phenomenon occurring entirely within the other person, a storm on their property, not a danger to ours. To maintain the boundary, we must refuse to let their emotions serve as a cue for us to retreat. We acknowledge their frustration, but we do not accept responsibility for resolving it. Alongside anger, we encounter the subtle weaponry of guilt messages. These are the manipulative communications designed to frame our self-stewardship as selfishness. They are accusations of betrayal, abandonment, or ingratitude. The solution requires us to decode these messages. They are often disguised expressions of the other person's own hurt, dependency, or refusal to take responsibility for themselves. By recognizing them as attempts to externalize internal pain, we can detach from the moral weight they attempt to impose. We do not need to justify our boundaries or defend our character. We simply need to maintain the line while offering empathy for the distress the other person feels in adapting to the new reality. The most severe form of external resistance manifests as countermoves and consequences. Controlling systems do not yield power gracefully. A parent may threaten disinheritance. A spouse may threaten separation. A friend may withdraw affection. These are the costs of freedom. The solution demands a sober calculation of these costs. We must accept that we cannot simultaneously control the reactions of others and possess our own lives. The risk of relationship loss is real, but it must be weighed against the certainty of losing oneself. The mature boundary builder prepares for these consequences, securing alternative sources of emotional and material support so that they are not coerced back into submission by the fear of survival. However, the more insidious battle is fought on the interior terrain. Internal resistance is the saboteur within the fortress. Its primary agent is guilt, not the true guilt of wrongdoing, but the distorted guilt of the overactive conscience. This internal judge, formed in the crucible of early childhood compliance, condemns the emerging self for the crime of autonomy. It whispers that self-care is selfishness and that saying no is an act of aggression. The solution involves a deliberate reprogramming of the conscience. We must learn to distinguish between the shoulds of our historical conditioning and the true ethical imperatives of love and responsibility. We must learn to tolerate the sensation of guilt without acting on it, understanding it as the friction of growth rather than the voice of truth. Fear constitutes another massive internal barrier, specifically, the fear of abandonment and the fear of the unknown. For the boundaryless individual, connection has always been purchased at the price of compliance. The unconscious equation is simple: if I am separate, I will be alone. To set a boundary feels like stepping into a void. The antidote to this fear is not isolation, but community. Boundaries cannot be built in a vacuum. We require a support system, a new family of relationships grounded in freedom and responsibility, to provide the safety net that allows us to take risks. We need others to validate our reality, to encourage our autonomy, and to provide the connection we fear losing. We solve the fear of abandonment not by clinging to toxic attachments, but by rooting ourselves in healthy ones. As we navigate this resistance, the development of healthy boundaries follows a discernible progression. It is a maturation process with distinct markers of success. Understanding these stages allows us to measure our progress and orient ourselves in the confusion of change. The process often begins with the emergence of resentment. Far from being a sin to be repressed, this early resentment is a vital signal. It is the smoke detector of the soul, alerting us that a violation has occurred. The ability to feel angry at being controlled or manipulated is the first sign that the self is waking up. It indicates that we have begun to value our property enough to object to its trespass. We move from a state of numb compliance to a state of conscious objection. This anger provides the initial energy required to push back against the inertia of old patterns. As we progress, we experience a shift in our relational tastes. We find ourselves less attracted to those who need rescuing or controlling, and more drawn to individuals who respect our limits. We begin to crave the company of boundary lovers, people who can accept a no without punishing us, and who take responsibility for their own lives. This shift signals that our internal definition of love is changing from a model of fusion and dependency to one of mutual freedom and respect. We are no longer seeking a parent or a project, we are seeking a peer. A critical milestone in this development is the decision to join the family of the responsible. We realize that we cannot heal in isolation. We actively seek out environments, support groups, healthy friendships, therapeutic relationships, where truth is spoken and limits are honored. We move from the secret isolation of our dysfunction into the light of community. This step acknowledges our limitation and our need for external resources to build internal structure. Simultaneously, we begin the work of treasuring our treasures. We start to view our time, energy, values, and feelings not as infinite resources to be plundered by whoever demands them, but as a limited endowment from God for which we are accountable. We embrace the concept of stewardship. We realize that saying yes to everyone is essentially saying no to the distinct purpose of our own lives. We begin to guard our hearts, not out of fear, but out of value. The practical application of this new valuation begins with baby no's. We do not start by confronting the most terrifying figure in our lives. We practice on safe targets: the telemarketer, the waiter, the supportive friend. We exercise the muscle of resistance in low-stakes environments to build strength and confidence. We learn that the world does not end when we disagree. This phase is crucial for retraining the nervous system to tolerate the anxiety of separation. As we grow stronger, we encounter a paradoxical phenomenon, an increase in guilt. As we begin to set real limits, the internal judge screams louder. We must learn to rejoice in this guilt. It is a sign that we are breaking the old rules of the dysfunctional system. If we were not challenging the status quo, the conscience would remain silent. The presence of this growth guilt confirms that we are moving toward autonomy. The solution is not to obey the guilt, but to endure it until the conscience aligns with the new reality of freedom. Eventually, we graduate to grown-up no's. We address the core conflicts with parents, spouses, and significant others. We bring the truth of our boundaries into the relationships that matter most. This is the crucible of maturity. It involves risking the relationship to save it. We state our limits clearly and enforce the consequences, even when it causes pain. We accept that we cannot make the other person understand or agree. We can only define what we will and will not participate in. The ultimate fruit of this labor is the disappearance of the guilt. We reach a stage where saying no feels as natural and moral as saying yes. The conscience has been retrained. We no longer feel like a bad person for having limits. We feel like a truthful one. We arrive at a place of internal integration where our choices are guided by values and love, not by compulsion and fear. This leads to the profound capacity to love the boundaries of others. Having fought for our own freedom, we cherish the freedom of those around us. We no longer need to control others or have them take care of us. We can accept their no without feeling rejected, recognizing it as an expression of their own stewardship. We become safe people for others, capable of genuine intimacy because we do not require fusion to feel secure. Finally, we achieve the freedom of our yes and our no. Our word becomes an accurate reflection of our will. When we say yes, it is a wholehearted commitment, unburdened by resentment. When we say no, it is a firm boundary, unburdened by guilt. We become trustworthy agents. Our lives are no longer a series of reactions to the demands of the day, but a proactive pursuit of value-driven goals. We plan, we execute, and we build, driven by an internal compass rather than external pressure. The application of these principles transforms the landscape of our daily existence. In the professional realm, the solution manifests as the refusal to carry the workload of the irresponsible. It means defining one's job description and sticking to it, recognizing that covering for a lazy colleague does not help them. It merely prolongs their incompetence. It involves the courage to let projects fail if the alternative is a violation of one's own limits. It means recognizing that our time is a finite resource that must be budgeted according to our own priorities, not the emergencies of others. We cease to be victims of the workplace and become professionals who negotiate terms of engagement. In marriage, the solution requires the dismantling of the codependent triangle of victim, rescuer, and persecutor. It means recognizing that we cannot control our spouse, but we can control our exposure to their destructive behaviors. We stop nagging, which is a futile attempt to change the other, and start acting. If a spouse is abusive, we create safety through distance. If a spouse is irresponsible, we allow the natural consequences of that irresponsibility to fall on them, rather than intercepting the pain. We realize that true submission is a free choice between equals, not the subjugation of a slave. By defining ourselves clearly, we create the possibility for true union, which requires two distinct whole persons. In parenting, the solution lies in the transition from external control to internal discipline. We recognize that our goal is not merely to force compliance, but to build a self-governing adult. We shift from being the source of all regulation to being the facilitator of cause and effect. We allow children to experience the pain of their choices, the loss of privileges, the failure of a grade, while the stakes are low, so they can learn the laws of reality. We model boundaries by respecting their personhood while staunchly defending our own, teaching them that the world will not adapt to their every whim. We provide the structure they lack until they can erect it for themselves. In our relationship with the self, the solution is the ruthless rooting out of the victim mentality. We stop asking why others treat us poorly and start asking why we allow it. We take ownership of our own needs, our own health, and our own spiritual growth. We stop waiting for a rescue that will never come and begin the hard work of parenting ourselves. We set limits on our own appetites, our own spending, and our own tongue, recognizing that self-control is the highest form of freedom. We embrace the pain of discipline to avoid the pain of regret. Ultimately, the solution brings us back to the nature of our relationship with the divine. We realize that God is the ultimate boundary keeper. He respects our freedom so profoundly that he allows us to reject him. He does not control, he invites. He does not rescue us from the consequences of our choices. He allows the laws of his universe to teach us. To adopt boundaries is to move into alignment with his character. It is to accept the dignity of being a free agent in a moral universe. The journey toward boundaries is the journey toward love. It is the realization that we cannot love our neighbor as ourselves if we have no self to love with. It is the understanding that a life without limits is a life without definition, and therefore a life without direction. By building the walls that define us, we create the gates that allow us to truly connect. We move from the chaos of the undefined property to the order of the cultivated garden. We cease to be the victims of circumstance and become the authors of our intent. We step out of the shadows of compliance and into the light of authenticity, fully present, fully responsible, and finally, fully free.